Well, if you have known me for very long or have heard me teach before, you maybe have heard me tell this story. Several years ago, my youngest son was playing flag football one day, and we ended the game, and they won their game, and he was in kindergarten or first grade. Honestly, I can't remember exactly which year it was, but we decided we're going to go grab some lunch after his flag football game. It was a Saturday. My in-laws were in town. Brandy's dad and her stepmom were here, and so we went, and we were going to have just a nice lunch together at the fancy establishment known as Mod Pizza. And so we show up, and, we get our pizzas, and we're sitting there, we're eating, and I was sitting at one end of the table. Brandy was next to me, and then Braden, and then Camden, my youngest, was sitting kind of all the way across the table on the other side from me, and then Brandy's stepmom, and then her dad. And so we're just having conversation. We had about wrapped up our meal. We were just kind of hanging out, talking, catching up, because we don't see them very often. And all of a sudden, just this weird, I don't even know, somehow Cam got my attention, which he's really good at getting my attention, but it's for all kinds of crazy reasons. But there was something different. I noticed he stood up, but he wasn't making any noise. And I looked at him like mid-conversation, and he had his hand all the way down his throat. And in that moment, I started to panic because I could tell he wasn't okay. And it was really bizarre because as soon as I noticed it, I jumped up out of my seat. I walked around the table, and he's not making any noise. His face is starting to change colors, and he's still got his hand down his throat. And I'm terrified because I realize my son is choking and he can't breathe. And so immediately I grab him, and it was so bizarre because as that was going on, I wasn't paying attention to anything else in the restaurant. It literally, I even asked Brandy later, I said, was it just silent when that happened? Like when I got up, the room went silent. She goes, no, it didn't. She goes, actually, Carol, her stepmom, was going, Jesus, 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 just like totally freaking out. And I have no memory of that. I don't remember anything. I don't remember hearing anything. I just remember seeing my son choking. I got up, I got behind him, and of course I started to perform the Heimlich maneuver on him, and I did 2 or 3 thrusts, and then I heard this kind of gasp and kind of gagging sound, and he pulls out of his mouth this long piece of cheese that it was melted, but it had hardened because it had gotten cold, and it had gotten stuck in his throat, and he couldn't breathe. And man, it was crazy. I was like, man, the Heimlich really works, because I've always been skeptical. And I've always been worried, too, that if I ever had to perform it, I wouldn't do it right. And fortunately, everything went well. But it was this crazy emotional moment. And what was bizarre is that in the days to follow, I remember going home, and we sat down to watch college football, and Camden is like right here, right next to me. Every time I got up, he got up. Every time I'd go to a different room, he'd go to a different room. I'm like going to the bathroom, and he's like, can I come in there too? And I'm like, no, dude, just like, it's going to be fine. But he was obsessed with being near me. Not only was he obsessed with being near me, but he began to not eat. And we didn't even realize it. But we recognized 3 or 4 days later that he wasn't eating his food at dinner, and he was hiding his food and making us think that he was eating, but he wasn't eating. And he was starting to lose weight. And it just started to really kind of freak us out. And the idea of going and eating pizza, he was completely against that idea. He was like, I'll never eat pizza again. I'll never go to Mod Pizza again. It was this crazy sequence of events, but he was troubled by what had happened that day. What he was experiencing was trauma. That's what trauma is. That's what I want us to talk about today, is I want us to think about, with the little bit of time that we have scheduled in our week to come together like this, I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about the idea of trauma, what trauma is. And the reason is because statistics say that more than 75% of us, so 3 out of every 4, so most likely the person sitting next to you has experienced something that has led to trauma in their life. And we can get confused, and we can begin to think that, it was just an event that happened. You need to suck it up and get over it. I think growing up as the generation that I grew up in, I don't think I really even understood what trauma was. Trauma was that, in my mind, it was this physical event that happened that was traumatic, and that was really it. And so there's this kind of this idea, like, hey, man, you fell down, you hurt yourself, like, rub some dirt on it and move on. Like, that's just, and so I think sometimes we can actually begin to think that that's the right way to react. But trauma is not just this event that happens. It's actually the response to the event. Let me give you a specific definition to what trauma is. Trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event such as abuse, an accident, or natural disaster. You see, trauma can be physical, trauma can be emotional, trauma can be spiritual, trauma can be mental. There's a lot of different things that can contribute to trauma in our lives. And when we're young, we like to say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but your words may never hurt me. But we all know as adults that's totally not accurate, because oftentimes what's most painful are the things that nobody can see in our lives. It's the trauma that we've experienced. There's 3 types of trauma I want to share with you. We're going to jump into scripture here in just a second. There's acute trauma, which is response from a one-time traumatic event. So maybe it was a car accident, a natural disaster. There was a time in your life where you experienced something at the hands of someone else. Someone else did something to you that was a traumatic event, just a one-time occurrence. Maybe it was a complicated health situation for you, or maybe somebody close to you. Maybe it was a hospital visit. And I know for me, sometimes I don't like going to hospitals because it brings back some memories of being in hospitals in times that wasn't good. Well, that's a traumatic experience. There's acute trauma and there's chronic trauma. Chronic trauma is a long-term response from prolonged or repeated events. Maybe you grew up in a time where for years you were bullied because there was something about you that stood out that made you different, or that people liked to pick on, or maybe you were a little bit smaller than everybody else, or there was something about you that you became the target of people who wanted to bully somebody. That's traumatic. Or maybe there was a time in your life where you experienced living in a racism, and you were judged and you were mistreated and you were interacted with in a way that wasn't healthy because of the way that you looked, because of the color of your skin, because of your socioeconomic status. Well, that's a prolonged traumatic experience. Or maybe there's complex trauma. Complex trauma is a response to multiple and ongoing events. Maybe you were raised in a home, or you're currently living in a home and raising kids in a home, or you're in an environment where there's a combination of several of these types of things going on. And so it's this complex trauma that you are experiencing. It's deeply distressing. It changes us. Trauma changes us. It changes the way that we think. It changes the way we interact. It changes the way that we trust people. It changes the way that we trust God. It changes the way we think about life. When I was in high school, I was coming back from baseball practice one day, and I was riding with a friend of mine, and I didn't have my driver's license yet. I was the youngest guy in my graduating class. I have a birthday in late August, and so I was the youngest guy in my class. I was the last person to get my driver's license. My dad was a police officer, so I never got to drive without a license like all my friends did when they were like 13. And so I'm riding back from baseball practice, going down Main Street in Van Horn, and a guy, right at the last minute, pulls out in front of my buddy who was driving, and we T-boned him right in the middle of the intersection. And I was not doing what my dad always told me to do by wearing my seatbelt. And so on impact, my face had a really strong interaction with the windshield. And my knees had a strong interaction with the dashboard. And there was a CB radio on the dash right there. And my knee cut open on the CB radio. The glass on the windshield shattered when my head hit it. And it was a painful experience. And fortunately, everything was really not that bad. It could have been a lot worse. It wasn't that bad of an accident. But something happened as a result of that accident. I became terrified to ride in the car with other people. And anytime I saw a car pull up to an intersection, if I was driving towards that intersection, riding with someone, I would start to get nervous. I would start to grip the handle a little bit tighter on the door frame, or like some of your spouses do every time you drive. Like I was just like, this is scaring me. You know, this is kind of freaking me out. It's probably the reason that if you and I are going to go somewhere, I'm going to tell you that I'm driving, because I don't trust you because of that experience. Because I trust my judgment over someone else's judgment. There's trauma that has informed some of the decisions that I make when it comes to driving. It's the reason that I wear my seatbelt all the time. I have worn my seatbelt every time I get in a vehicle since that day. It's just, it changed me. That's what trauma does. And maybe that's something you've experienced in your life. Something has happened to you. You've had to walk through something that was not normal, that was painful, and it's led you to this place where you struggle to trust people. Or maybe you struggle to trust God, or you begin to ask yourself, does God really care about me? Because if he did, why did this go the way that it went? Or maybe you struggle to get close to people, because if you get close to people, you're setting yourself up to experience the pain that you've experienced in your past. Or maybe you've landed in this place as a parent, and you are so protective of your children that you're not allowing them to experience the fullness of being a child, but for fear of what might happen to them because of what happened to you, and so you're overprotective. Well, those are all trauma-informed decisions. You see, it changes us, it impacts us. So what I want to do is I want to look at a story in the book of 2 Samuel chapter 13. And this is a story about Tamar, Amnon, and Absalom. These are David's children, King David and Goliath. This is David's children, and this is an awful story. It's a terrible story, but I want us to see, as we understand what trauma is, I think we see in the story what trauma does to us and where it can lead us. But I also want us to land in a place this morning where not only do we recognize what trauma is and what it can do to us, but we recognize the steps that we can take to begin to find healing from the trauma in our lives. That's what I think the goal for today, my prayer today, is that we would experience healing, that we would discover a peace that heals our trauma. So let's go ahead and read 2 Samuel chapter 13. We're going to pick up in verse 11. This is a story where, let me just give you a little context. Amnon has been scheming because of some really unhealthy, inappropriate desires that he has for his sister. He has been trying to coordinate and scheme a way where he can find him and his sister alone so that he can do what he wants to do. So this is a terrible story, but we find ourselves in this situation, and I want us to specifically see what Tamar's reaction is to what's happened to her. It says, when she brought them to him to eat, she's bringing food to her brother Amnon, who has orchestrated this situation for his benefit. It says, he took hold of her and said to her, come sleep with me, my sister. But she said to him, no, my brother, do not violate me, for such a thing is not done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful sin. As for me, where could I get rid of my shame? And as for you, you will be like one of the fools in Israel. Now then, please speak to the king, for he will not withhold me from you. However, he would not listen to her. Since he was stronger than she, he violated her and slept with her. Then Amnon hated her with a very great hatred. Indeed, the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her. And Amnon said to her, get up, go away. But she said to him, no, because this is wrong, and sending me away is greater than the other that you have done to me. Yet he would not listen to her. Then he called his young man who had attended to him and said, now throw this woman out of my presence and lock the door behind her. Now she had a long-sleeved garment, for this is how the virgin daughters of the king dressed themselves in robes. Then his attendant took her out and locked the door behind her. And verse 19 says, Tamar took ashes and put them on her head and tore her long-sleeved garment which was on her. And she put her hand on her head and went on her way, crying as she went. Then Absalom, her brother, said to her, has Amnon your brother been with you? But now, keep silent, my sister. He is your brother. Do not take this matter to heart. So Tamar remained and was isolated in her brother Absalom's house. Now when King David heard about all these matters, he became very angry. But Absalom did not speak with Amnon, either good or bad, for Absalom hated Amnon because he had violated his sister. Now it became after 2 full years that Absalom had sheep shearers in Belshazzar, and that goes on to talk about stuff that's not relevant to this story. But here's this incredibly awful picture, this scene, this experience that Tamar has just walked through. Someone she should have trusted, who had strength over her, took advantage of her and took something from her. And not only did that happen, but another one who was stronger than her, that she was supposed to trust, who was supposed to be for her, says it's not that big of a deal. Let's just cover it up. Let's just keep it quiet. David ultimately finds out about this, her dad, and he does nothing about it. He just keeps it quiet. This is a terrible experience for Tamar. And there is trauma that has been experienced in this situation by Tamar, and you see some things that happen as a result of that the trauma leads to. The first thing is hopelessness. We see this in verse 19. It says that Tamar took ashes and put them on her head. That's representative of this extreme grief and despair. She's found herself in a place of desolation. She's in this place where she begins to think, this is it. This is all I'll ever be. Everything that I thought I would be, everything that I am, everything that I've always been told is true about me is now no longer true. She's in despair because she feels like that's all been taken from her. She probably had dreams for the future, dreams for what her life would turn into, for a family that she would have one day. But what we know about this culture is that when there was someone who engaged in premarital sex in this culture, then they were seen and they were shamed. They were looked at as not valuable, as just a waste to society. Nobody would want to start a family with Tamar because of what's happened to Tamar. So she's overwhelmed. But as she thinks about her future, she's thinking to herself, there's no way that this is ever going to turn around. There's no way this is ever going to be good. But you notice what she also does. She puts the ashes on her head, which represents the grief, represents the shame. That's what she was doing by putting the ashes on her head. But she also tore the long-sleeved robe, the garment that she had on. She tore the sleeves off of it. Here's what's fascinating about this is that Tamar was wearing that robe because she was a daughter of the king. And I think it's a picture of her walking through this traumatic experience, and her response to the experience is begin to believe that her identity has now changed, and she's no longer worthy of being a daughter of the king. So she tears off parts of the royal robe because she thinks to herself, there's no way that can be my identity anymore. She's been abused. There's no chance of being married and having a family again. She's hopeless. Why does this matter for us? Because I think if we walk through situations that are this traumatic, or maybe not even this traumatic, it can lead us to a place where we begin to think the same way. We begin to have negative thoughts about ourselves, negative thoughts about our future, negative thoughts of all the hopes and dreams that we had for ourselves. What can actually begin to happen even when we're children and we walk through a traumatic experience is it begins to short-circuit our minds. We begin to stunt in our development. We can't process things the way that we're supposed to in natural human development, both emotionally and intellectually. All as a result of trauma. But listen, there's hope, because this is all getting really heavy. But there's hope for us, and that's how we're going to land this today. But we see for Tamar, she's wrestling with hopelessness. Not only is she wrestling with hopelessness and overwhelmed with that, she's also heartbroken. She's just absolutely devastated at what's going on. We see in verse 19, the second part of 19, it says that she put her hand on her head and she went away crying aloud as she went. She runs away weeping and wailing. I mean, she's incredibly emotional. Anybody would that has walked through a situation like this. She's overwhelmed with grief. Something has been taken from her, has been robbed from her. Someone she trusted has broken that trust, has taken advantage of her. She's grieving the missed expectations for her life. I know for some, you've been in a place where there's been a hurt that's been so deep that it feels like it's robbing you from life. It's real. It's painful. It's paralyzing. There's disappointment. There's discouraging thoughts. There's confusion. Maybe it was the marriage relationship that failed, or the divorce, or it was the break of a trust between a close family friend. Now you find yourself in a place of loneliness. Heartbreak often leads to more heartbreak if we stay in the heartbreak. You see this sometimes. You see where people who get stuck in this place that's so easy to get stuck into, where it begins to negatively impact their life. And we don't choose that, but it's what we gravitate towards sometimes. Sometimes someone who has maybe walked through a chronic traumatic experience of an absent father will begin to overcompensate by trying to find anything to replace the love, the affection, the attention of the father in their life. And the result of that oftentimes leads to more traumatic experiences. You see this happen over and over. This is what Tamar is experiencing. Not only is she experiencing heartbreak, she's experiencing a hidden hurt because they're telling her, you need to keep this quiet. This doesn't need to be told to anybody. No one needs to know about this. We're just going to keep this between us. Don't say anything. No one needs to know. She's probably thinking to herself, what are people going to think if they knew? Maybe it is best that this just stay quiet, because if it stays quiet, no one will know, and maybe there will be a future for me. There's something very dangerous about staying quiet. Because when things stay quiet, we begin to process things in an echo chamber, and oftentimes it leads to more guilt, or we begin to think and own responsibility for on ourselves when it really was never our fault to begin with. So we begin to carry extra guilt. It leads to isolation, to shame, to depression, to self-harm, because we keep it all to ourselves. We become hostages to our secrets. Here's what I want you to know today. Your darkest secret does not have to be your death sentence. And there's hope for us. And what's incredibly sad is when you think about the story of Tamar, we don't know anything else about Tamar. This is the end of her story. This is how her story ends. And so if we stopped here, it'd be really easy to leave here thinking, man, there's no hope. But there actually is hope. Because we see in other instances in the Bible, other stories throughout Scripture where people have walked through traumatic experiences but then have come out on the other side, not just healed, but have come out stronger. You see it in the life of Paul. I mean, Paul is someone that we've all heard about. If you've been in church for very long at all, you've heard about the Apostle Paul. Paul experienced every kind of traumatic experience. He experienced acute trauma. He experienced chronic trauma. He experienced complex trauma. The guy who is responsible for writing 2/3 of the New Testament walked through some incredibly traumatic experiences. And here's the deal. After he trusted Jesus, but it started when he first encountered Jesus. I mean, if you know the story, Paul is on the road to Damascus and God gets his attention. And it says that a light comes from heaven and it knocks him off his donkey and he's blind. Well, let's not overcomplicate that. It sounds to me like he got struck by lightning, all right? Like this is a traumatic experience. But not only is he struck by lightning and loses his eyesight, but then there's a voice from heaven that begins to speak to him. And it's not a voice that says, hey, Paul, my beloved, Paul, the chosen one. Instead, it's a voice from heaven after he's been struck by lightning. He says, Paul, why are you persecuting me? Like, I don't know about you, but that happens in my life. Like, there's probably no recovery. I'm just like, man, just go ahead and take me out right now. So then here's Paul, blind for 3 days, not knowing if he's going to ever get his vision back. Like, that's a traumatic experience. But he had been killing Christians. He had been inflicting pain and trauma in the lives of so many other people. God knocks him off his donkey, gets his attention. There's another crazy experience. And he goes from being a killer of Christians to being an ambassador for Jesus and telling people about Jesus. He becomes the one who's responsible for writing most of the New Testament. But even throughout all of his missionary journeys, all that he's doing as he's writing Scripture, he's experiencing traumatic event after traumatic event after traumatic event, running from city to city because people are trying to take his life. They're trying to kill him. He's shipwrecked. He's cold. He's imprisoned. He's beaten. I mean, we can see this. We can read it. I don't have this on the screen. Let me just kind of go through this list. You can find this in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, starting verse 23. Paul is writing about some of the traumatic experiences that he's experienced. It says that he's had far more imprisonments. He's been beaten times without number. Like, he can't even count the number of times he's been beaten. Often in danger of death. 5 times I received from the Jews 39 lashes. That was something they had specifically figured out, that a man could survive 39 lashes but not 40 lashings. And so they would beat a man 39 times, and if he died because he was beaten to death. But if he died from 40, then he would die from murder, so they would stop at 39. This happened to Paul. He was shipwrecked. Night and day I've spent adrift at sea. I've had frequent journeys and dangers from rivers, dangers from robbers, dangers from countrymen, dangers from the Gentiles, dangers in the city, dangers in the wilderness, dangers at sea. I mean, this is overwhelming if you really stop and begin to process each one of these situations. He says, I've been in labor and hardship through many sleepless nights and hunger and thirst, often without food, and cold and exposure. Like, that's a lot. So here's Paul, one of the heroes of the Christian faith, who's experienced incredible amounts of trauma. But here's where I think we begin to turn this around. Here's where I think we begin to experience healing from the trauma. We begin to experience peace and hope from the trauma, is I think we can do what Paul's doing. Like Paul's walked through all of these things, and he's talking about this. So the first thing I think we do is we process the pain specifically with other people. There's something valuable in being able to acknowledge it, or to be able to talk about it, to discuss it, and not necessarily just jumping on Facebook Live and telling everybody everything about all your traumatic experiences, but finding trusted people you begin to have dialogue with, begin to talk about. You and I will never begin to heal ourselves. We'll never begin to find healing if we continue to ignore the wound. Paul is processed through some of this trauma. You think about Tamar, she was never able to do that. We don't ever read anything more about her story. So the worst thing we could do is ignore it, dismiss it, try to forget it. Instead, what would it look like to begin to engage in some conversation, some healthy conversation? Begin to say things and identify and acknowledge specifically what happened to us. I was hurt. I was in pain. I was abused. Listen, I think we got to be careful, because I think we live in a day and age, though, where even acknowledging it, we can get on this slippery slope where we think everything that was difficult brings trauma. And sometimes I think we can jump into this place where we think everything was abuse. Everything was someone trying to cause harm for us. Listen, if there's times where we've needed to be corrected, or we've needed to be held accountable because what we're doing is not what's best, like that's not abuse. Abuse is not someone just simply disagreeing with me. Abuse is not just someone believing something different than what I believe. So we have to be careful to not just lump everything into being abuse and resulting in trauma. But where there's been something that's resulted in trauma, we need to be specific about it. I was hurt. I was abused. I was abandoned. I was mistreated. And it's hard because it leads us to a place where we become vulnerable and we feel weak and we feel like, man, I want to be strong. I want to be courageous. And recognizing these things and calling them out and acknowledging them it actually puts us in a place where we feel really vulnerable and weak and terrified. But what would it look like to have someone that you could truly begin to talk to about these things? Begin to process. Maybe it's a story team. Maybe it's someone in your family. Maybe it is a counselor. To begin to process and acknowledge, because I think it's incredibly difficult to find healing from the things we've never specifically been able to identify. And I think it's also impossible to be fully loved when we're not fully known. And there's so much value in having people in our lives who fully know us, everything we've experienced, so that we're not worried about whether or not they really love us. Because I think sometimes we put up this fake image of who we are so that people will love us. But that's not real love. What does it look like to be fully known so that we can be fully loved with other people? We're better together. Iron sharpens iron, unless it's in an echo chamber. What would it look like to have this in our lives? Paul says in 2 Corinthians 1, verse 9, if you go back to the beginning of this book that he writes in Corinthians, it says, indeed, we had the sentence of death within ourselves so that we would not trust in ourselves. He says, we had the sentence of death within. He's saying, I felt like I needed to die. That's what Paul's saying. There's been times in his life where he's been in this place where because of the circumstances and the situations he walked through, he felt like he'd be better off dead. But then he lands in a place where he's able to talk about it. He's able to have conversation about it. Listen, if you've ever hurt so bad because of the things that you've had to walk through where you feel like, I just need to die, maybe there's some hope for you today that the man who wrote 2/3 of the New Testament had felt the exact same way. But there's steps that are available. There's steps that we can take. What did he do? He talked about it. He wrote about it. He processed it with other people. I encourage you to find someone that you can talk to. Maybe there's somebody on your story team. One thing I want to encourage you to do, and we did this a couple weeks ago, and I want to make this available again today. I've said this a couple of times throughout this teaching collection, but one of the things that I want us to always know is true is that asking for help is not a sign of weakness. Asking for help is a sign of wisdom. And so a few weeks ago, I had you, as we were talking about depression, and I led you, some of you were probably thinking in your mind, man, counseling might be the best step for me, but you don't really know where to start because it's difficult. If you've never been to counseling, you've never talked to a counselor, you've never tried to communicate with someone who's been to counseling, then that idea can be incredibly overwhelming. And so here's what I want to do is I want to be able to help you take that step. Not so that I can call you out, but to just say, hey, listen, let me kind of give you an on-ramp to talk to someone professionally who's equipped and trained to walk through some of these difficult situations. So if that's you, and you're like, man, I've never been to counseling, but I'd like to go because I need to acknowledge it. I need to process this with somebody. I want you to take this card at some point, and I want you to write your name on it and write the word wisdom anywhere on this card. Your name, phone number, and wisdom. And this week, I'm going to simplify it even more because I think one of the things I learned a couple weeks ago is that me contacting some of you maybe even feels more overwhelming because you're like, man, I don't want to talk to Wes about this, and I can understand that. There are some counselors that I know that I trust, that I believe in, that will contact you this week. And if finances are part of the struggle in not pursuing counseling, we will help subsidize the cost for the first several counseling sessions that you want to step into. I want to try to remove all the barriers for us becoming the best version of ourselves, from living the life God has set us out to live. Paul processed the pain with other people. And then in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, should be on the screen, it says, my grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, I will rather boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may dwell in me. Therefore, I delight in weaknesses, in insults, in distresses, in persecutions, in difficulties, in behalf of Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong. My grace is sufficient for you. Paul is he is communicating what God has spoken to him. This passage comes from the passage where Paul is talking about the thorn in his flesh. He's talking about he talks about going to God because he's got this thorn in his flesh. There's this, we don't know what this is. Scholars debate on what it was Paul was talking about, but we all kind of feel that. We all kind of have that thorn in our flesh. Some of you are sitting next to that thorn in your flesh. Don't elbow your thorn in the flesh right now in this moment. Let's be nice today. But Paul had something that was a constant struggle for him, something that was constantly pulling him down, holding him back. And 3 different times he's going to God. And I don't think it was just one specific prayer. I think there were probably seasons in his life, 3 different seasons in his life where he is going to God and he's saying, God, would you remove this thorn from my life? Would you make this go away? He's pleading with him. I think that's a step we can take. As we process the pain with others, then we can prayerfully begin to press into God. Prayerfully press into God. Cry out to God. Talk to God. Vent to God. Be still with God. Turn off everything. Disconnect from everything. Just be still. Complain to God. Say, God, why did this have to happen? God, I thought you loved me, but this doesn't feel like you love me. God, I want to trust you, but I'm not sure that I can trust you because the people in my life that I thought I was supposed to trust, I can't trust them, so why should I trust you? Like go to God with this. Talk to him about it. God, why did you allow that? God, you could have stopped that. Why didn't you stop that from happening? Let him, sometimes I think we get stuck in this mindset where we think, if I go to God, I got to go to God and I got to pray about, the direction that he wants me to go. I need to give him praise. I need to give him thanks, but we stop before we give him any of our hurts. I think what Paul does is he shows us this in 2 Corinthians where he's going to God with what doesn't feel good, the thorn in the flesh. And what is God's response? My grace is sufficient for you, for power is perfected in weakness. In other words, maybe it's the thing that has caused the most pain in your life that God's going to use to show you how great his power can be in your life. And I believe that begins to happen as we prayerfully pursue him, as we prayerfully press in to God, taking it to God. Process the pain with others, prayerfully press into God, and lastly, pursue purpose. Now, I know that this already, depending on where you are in your trauma journey, this might feel a little bit uncomfortable. This might even make you mad to hear me say this, and that's okay, because some of you aren't ready for this, and that's normal. Part of the healing process is to eventually get to this place where you're able to talk about it. You're able to share your story, to use it on purpose. This is what Paul is doing in this passage. He's using all that he has, all that he's experienced, he's using his story to point people to God. Every single one of us have an opportunity to do that, where we can take where we have experienced pain, but we've begun to experience the healing and the peace and the hope that can be restored, and we can use that to help other people who are still stuck in the pain. Now, that doesn't happen overnight. We don't just land there because we just decide one day, you know what, I'm good. Like, this is a process. This is a journey. And there will be a point, if you're not there now, there will be a point as we continue to press in where what you've experienced will become a part of your story that God will use to draw other people to himself, that God will use to bring comfort to other people. Isaiah chapter 61. I'll close with this passage. The prophet Isaiah is prophesying to the people to remind them of who God is. What's interesting is this same prophecy is quoted by Jesus in Luke chapter 4. But the original prophecy is in Isaiah chapter 61, starting in verse 1. It says, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because the Lord anointed me to bring good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted." This is a promise. And so maybe even today, like, if God would just allow me to prophesy this over us, like what he's saying, he wants us to remember, to bring good news to the humble. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim release to the captives and freedom to the prisoners. Maybe that's how you feel in some of the situations you walk through. You feel imprisoned to what you've experienced, to the pain that you're carrying. What would it look like to begin to trust God, to take it to him, and trust him with it so that he can begin to set us free? To proclaim the favorable year of the Lord and the day of vengeance for our God, to comfort all who mourn, to grant those who mourn in Zion, giving them a garland instead of ashes, the oil of gladness instead of mourning. Did you catch that? Garland instead of ashes. What he's saying, it's the same word that's used for the word crown. To give you a crown instead of ashes. If I think back to Tamar's story, in her greatest devastation and despair, she puts ashes on her forehead because she's begun to take on the identity of this is who I am now. I'm no longer worthy to be a daughter of the king. I'm no longer worthy to be a daughter of my father. And in this passage it says he trades those ashes in for a crown, for a garland, to restore the identity that you were created for. As a son of the king, as a daughter of the king, as a son or a daughter of your heavenly Father. The oil of gladness instead of mourning, the cloak of praise instead of a disheartened spirit, so they will be called oaks of righteousness. Notice it doesn't say so that you will be called an oak of righteousness. There's this plurality to this, oaks of righteousness, which means that we heal together. We heal together, unified as a body of people. And oaks are strong. How do we grow stronger? Together with each other, trusting God. The planting of the Lord that he may be glorified, the planting of the Lord that he may be glorified. What does all that mean? Two things happen. As we process this, as we prayerfully take this to God, and he begins to heal us and restore what's been broken, what begins to happen is he begins to remind us of who we are. He begins to change our identity back to what we originally were created to be. And then he also begins to change our story. And as he changes our story, sometimes the greatest mess we've experienced becomes our loudest message. The struggle that you've wrestled with for years becomes the story that God wants to use to bring comfort in the pain for those around you. Not so that we can just be happy about that, but so that he receives the glory for that. Your story is powerful. Your story of healing is life-changing. And how does that happen? Well, we trust him. I need to be healed. I need healing. I need to start this process of healing. I'm going to take the journey. Listen, nothing can change what happened to you, but God can heal your broken heart. I believe that. And I believe God wants to do that for some of us today. And so the question is will Tamar's story be your story? Will the pain always be the end, or will Paul's story be your story? My prayer is that Paul's story would be all of our stories, and we get to walk through this and find healing. Now, usually this is where I would stop and share a story with you about someone whose life experience was painful and difficult and complicated, and they began to take these steps, and God restored them, and God's using their life to do all these amazing things, and there's stories like that are represented in this room. But I think for today, what I wanted to do is I wanted to really just be able to like come sit down in a seat by someone. Just come sit down. But the cameras wouldn't be able to capture that. It's dark. You wouldn't be able to see me, and I probably would make somebody feel really, really uncomfortable. Be like, Wes is sitting next to me. What's he about to ask me to do? This is weird. But here's why I was thinking and considering that. Because I don't want you to always just see me as a pastor. Because I'm a person, just like you, ordinary, with pain, with struggles. The person next to you is a person with pain and struggles. Listen, I've been hurt too. I know what pain feels like. So I'm not standing up here trying to say these things, hoping that it connects. The truth is that for many of us right now, we're not okay. What you're experiencing isn't normal. I mean, you feel that. The anger, it's not normal. The cynicism is not normal. Somebody says something that you don't agree with, and things just get crazy and start fighting and don't talk anymore. Like, that's not normal. And what's crazy is over the last 3 or 4 years, it seems like that's become just even more chaotic. The trauma and the brokenness and the hurt just seems to be out of control. That's not normal. And that's not you. But something maybe has happened to you. You're not okay because you're just not okay. And that's okay. It's okay to not be okay. We don't have to stay that way. But here's what I want you to know. Not only can you be healed, but you can be stronger. Not because of this process or these steps that just are made up, but because in our weakness, then we're made strong through Christ. Because remember what I said. Who quoted Isaiah 61? Jesus did. Right after he had been in the desert for 40 days and had faced every single temptation that you can imagine. Jesus said, I'm here for the brokenhearted, to exchange the garland for ashes, to heal, to restore. When I think about what Jesus did, if you go and read in John chapter 19, it says that they took his clothes. They hung him on the cross naked. Like they took his clothes and like he's exposed, exploited, shamed, not behind some closed doors, but for everyone to see. The reason I say that is because Jesus understands the pain. Jesus understands trauma. It's at the cross of Jesus that we get the full extent of evil in the world. But it's also at the cross of Jesus that we see the full extent of the love of God. Because Jesus chose to take that route so that he could be God with us, so that we could experience healing, so that we could not just be healed, but so that we could be strong. Listen, trauma might not be your fault, but pursuing God for healing is your responsibility. And so I want to push you today. I don't want to just kind of, I want to push you. Like pastors are supposed to comfort the afflicted. Today I want to afflict the comfortable. I want to push you towards Jesus. In your pain, in your trauma, run to Jesus. You're not going to feel better in an instant, but the healing process will begin as you begin to trust him and you rally around with people who are trusting him, and we begin to experience the best version of ourselves, and we begin to find peace that heals the trauma. Let's pray.